Right, hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. My name is Howard, I'm the convener of Greater Canberra. I will be moderating the panel later on. I will also be the designated talking person for walking through the various logistics and other elements of tonight. I'm joined here by my incredible team and our incredible panel, who I'll introduce online shortly. Before we do though, a few housekeeping things. One, this entire event is being live streamed. The sacrificial iPhone that you see up on the tripod there is the window through which everyone in the future will view this event through. So please do not talk too loudly near it, and do not walk in front of it if you possibly can. So just moving on to the next slide. Alright, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of which we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the various Missing Middle Canberra coalition partners who can't be here tonight, particularly the YWCA and the YMCA. And I'd also like to acknowledge all of our support organisations who are here tonight, including our wonderful panel members. Just to get, I've already covered off the logistics, and so we'll go to the next slide. In terms of the structure of tonight, the way we're going to do it is we've got the panel discussion. That'll be coming up in around about half an hour or so. However, all of you are here tonight because of this organisation called Missing Middle Canberra, which has a very esoteric planning policy platform. And when I talk to most people about planning, their eyes immediately glaze over. And so it'd be kind of awkward if you turned up here tonight and had a relatively thin grasp of what was going on in terms of what we're actually proposing. So I'm just going to relatively briefly, attempt to walk through what Missing Middle Canberra is, what the policy platform is, and that means that when we have our wonderful architects and other experts up to talk about the entire platform in detail, you're in a better position to understand what's going on. So Missing Middle Canberra has four pillars, or four elements to the platform. One of which is upzoning all of RZ1, and once again, if your eyes immediately glazed over at that acronym, don't worry, that's normal. We will be explaining what that means. To RZ2, exempting that development from what's called a development approval, which we'll also get to. Upzoning all of RZ2 to RZ3, allowing more apartments above local shops, and then reducing parking minimums for all residential zones to 1 per dwelling. Now, if all of that is gibberish to you, don't worry, that's normal. We're going to go through it. So this to the next slide. So RZ1 is the most common type of zone within Canberra. If you've ever walked down a suburban street and you've seen detached houses on either side, that's because that street is most likely within what's called the RZ1 zone. So RZ1 makes up 80% of Canberra's residential land and about 64% of overall land. So it makes up close to 2/3 of Canberra by urban footprint. So there's a few key features. 1 dwelling per block. There's an asterisk to all of this, by the way. You're allowed to build a dual occupancy on large RZ1 blocks, but at the moment or previously, last week, we'll get to the weird things that have happened. It couldn't be unit titled, so really only 1 house per block. You can't subdivide or combine blocks, so you can't split a particularly large block into 2 separate smaller blocks. And it has a maximum height of 2 stories, various size and setback rules, and a minimum of 2 parking spaces must be provided as part of the dwelling, some exceptions to 1-bedroom houses. If you're a professional that works in this area and I have mangled it or oversimplified it, I beg for your forgiveness. So just on to the next slide. So this is RZ1 around Canberra. And I've selected a selection of Tuggeranong, O'Connor, I believe this is Juralang or maybe Florrie, I think that's Florrie, Forest, Denman Prospect, and Kayleen. So RZ1 takes many forms, but it's just a detached house. So if we just go to the next slide. So this is what RZ1 looks like from space. I have picked Florrie in Belconnen as an example. This is a very typical kind of pattern of the urban development that we're talking about in the Wineland districts of Canberra, so Belconnen, Woden, Tuggeranong, etc. So we just go to the next slide. So as we previously covered, RZ1 is by far the most common type of zoning in Canberra, taking up 80% of our residential land. And it's also the default zoning type wherever. The most important thing to realise is that in Canberra, you're not allowed to change your block size. And this means that while RZ1 is everywhere, the size of those RZ1 blocks change dramatically between different suburbs. So the largest suburb by block size is Forest, which was intentionally designed for high-ranking public servants in the 1920s, and that's why they get the average of 1,800 square metres for their blocks, which can never be changed. You can't subdivide it, it's a mansion protection scheme. Right down to an average of 491 across Gingalan as a district. Importantly, because there's different RZ1 rules around green space and setbacks and site coverage ratios in different size blocks, this means that there isn't one RZ1 zone, there's about 3 in practice, and this means you end up with different rules between different parts of Canberra that lead to this weird kind of planning segregation by socioeconomic income, even though it's all nominally one zone. Anyway, next slide. Okay, everything that is this colour is RZ1. And that over there on the left from your angle, that is Belconnen. Belconnen is about the most strictly average of Canberra's districts. It has more density than places like Woden or Tuggeranong, but it has less than places like the Inner North or Gingalan. So I picked it as a pretty good exemplar. And as you can see, RZ1 is everywhere. And the standard pattern of a standard Canberra suburb, which is given by Flora here, is there is RZ1 in the vast majority of the suburb. And then there's the small local shops, and then there's RZ2. And that's how we've made our city work. So if we just go to the next slide. Cool. Now we've got a grasp on what RZ1 is, which is what we're looking at changing. We're going to talk a little bit about RZ2, which is what the Missing Middle Canberra platform proposes to change RZ1 to. Now, RZ2 already exists, and this is important for us because we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So RZ2 allows 2 dwellings on blocks over 700 square metres, and then an additional dwelling per additional 250. So this is different than just allowing duplexes, no matter what the size of the block is. If you have a 1,200 square metre block, you're allowed up to 4 dwellings on it. Other than that, the rules are very similar to RZ1. It's still ground total of 2 stories in height. There's very similar rules around setbacks and site coverage ratios and vegetation and green space. And what we're really talking about is this is a townhouse, terraces, low-rise apartment kind of area. So parking rules here get a little bit funky because we head into this terrible thing called the multi-unit dwelling and parking code. I may have butchered the exact title of that. And also the new planning system entered into force 3 days ago. So I'm not completely across what all the new parking requirements are in every new zone, because they might have changed it from the draft ones to the new ones. But at least as we previously understood it, it's an average, it's 1 if it's a 1-bedroom apartment or unit, and then 1.5 if it's multi-dwelling. So that's lower than RZ1, which requires 2, but it's higher than, as we'll talk about, that most people need. Right, we'll go to the next slide. And this is examples of what RZ2 looks like around Canberra. So most common thing is a kind of duplex arrangement like this, but on larger blocks you can kind of get rows of townhouses like that, etc. These are examples that are drawn from real areas of Canberra. I think the one on the left might be a render, but the other ones are definitely existing houses which you can see in the street. So we'll go to the next slide. Okay, once again, the RZ2 is a pain. So there are around 90,000 or so, I think, RZ1 blocks in Canberra, and then there's around about 9,000 RZ2. So they're outnumbered 10 to 1 by RZ1 blocks, but RZ2 exists in nearly every suburb in Canberra, particularly every old suburb. When we did the last round of planning reforms in the early 2000s, and we did the question, okay, how would we create more density in existing suburbs? After many years of a lot of work and effort, RZ2 was the answer. So, and it's a zone which people understand. So let's go to the next one. So this is what happens when we zoom that map out. Once again, everything in the light orange is RZ1. It has 1 house on it, 1 house on the lane, and that can never change. It was under the previous planning system. We'll come to the ACT government's weird half-measure RZ1 policy shortly. But you'll see that effectively that's true for nearly all of Canberra's suburbs. Once again, Belconnen actually has more density allowed than Tuggeranong, Western Creek, but Gingalan has more, and you can actually see the light rail in those darker shades of red, which is the higher residential zones, RZ3, RZ4, RZ5. So just go to the next one. Yeah, RZ3 is medium density. It's once again limited to 2 stories. It has the same rules around parking, but it has more permissive site coverage and setback requirements that allow for high density. Might just give you a moment to read the slide if you want to. Right, that we'll move on. Okay, and this is some examples of RZ3. I believe this one is in Turner, and I think that one may be in Downer. There's some RZ3 along the light rail corridor. So if we just go to the next slide. So there is very little RZ3 in Canberra. So much so that when I took Belconnen as my example, I realized that I may not have any RZ3 at all, and then I found it in Bruce. So all that kind of middle shade of pink there, not the darker one in Bruce, that's RZ3, and the deeper shades of red that you can see just in Wallsend and Lawson are the RZ4 and RZ5 zones. All right, and then we'll just move along. Okay, so that covers off what RZ1 is, what RZ2 is, and what RZ3 is. The Missing Middle Canberra platform is to move all of RZ1 to RZ2, all of RZ2 to RZ3, and that's the fundamental core of what we're doing with residential zoning. But the fourth pillar is we also want to make modifications to how local shops work. So currently you are allowed to have apartments of local shops in some circumstances, but it's very hard. There are design requirements, there are heavier restrictions to defer to relax that and allow for a higher degree of apartments of local shops. To give an example of what this looks like in practice, so this is the Mika development in Campbell. That's quite new. That's an example of what we'll be looking at. We have a real problem in Canberra where many of our local shopping centres and many suburbs are struggling because they can't get enough money, they can't get investment and they don't have enough customers, because the overall population of the suburbs which they serve has declined, because RZ1 means you've locked in the amount of houses which you can have, but we went from having 5 people per house full of young children in the 1970s when the suburbs were new to having 1 or 2 retirees. That means that the amount of total people which need to use those local shopping centres has declined, and we think that by allowing apartments above local shopping centres, we give a real opportunity for renewal. This is the Air Market development in Kingston. Kingston's a group centre, but it still gives an example of the vibe of what is possible when you have apartments immediately above a kind of local shopping centre. All right, we'll just move along. Okay, this is the part that generally stated the parking requirements from the old parking development code. There's many asterisks with this. It doesn't apply as cleanly within town centres and civic areas, which are different zoning rather than residential. But essentially, you get 1 parking space for a single bedroom dwelling, a minimum provision of 1.5 for 2 bedroom and above, 2 parking alike, and etc. So we're looking at quite high levels of parking provision. So we just go along. Okay, well, why this matters and why we're proposing to reduce the minimum parking to 1 rather than 2 per dwelling is that the most common household in Canberra has 1 car. But on 80% of our residential land, we require that the house has 2 parking spots. What this means, particularly when you combine that with the fact that like every apartment is required to have an average of 1.5 parking spots, is that Canberrans are literally paying for tens of thousands of parking spots which they do not want and they do not need. The problem here is that most of those parking spots are underground, and that means that they're very expensive in apartment blocks, and they meaningfully restrict what can be done with the areas and how much housing can be built. So effectively, by reducing the amount of parking provision to 1 rather than like minimum, rather than the current state of 2 or 1.5 for most dwellings, we allow people who want to live with only 1 car to buy a house that meets their needs, or a home that meets their needs, and they don't need to pay tens of thousands of dollars in construction costs for an underground parking spot. Right, next slide. So Minneapolis, the American city, in 2020 abolished parking minimums entirely. New South Wales, like not New South Wales, New Zealand also abolished parking minimums nationally as well 2 years ago. And what we can see is as soon as people were allowed to not spend money on parking, 2019 is the last year before, the amount of parking built as part of new builds dived. So basically, if we allowed people to not, if we didn't force people to buy parking, less parking would be built, would allow people to trade off and instead get around by public transport, would save money on housing and construction costs. Right, next slide. All right, so as we'll hear, Greater Canberra was the one who pitched effectively the idea of the Missing Middle Coalition to various organisations. And the answer is, but why are we doing this? Why are we asking people to look at reforming our residential zoning codes to do this? Why are we moving from one standard to the next? The most important one for me personally, that changes between different members of Greater Canberra because we all come together for different reasons, and different members of our coalition have different motives as well within the Missing Middle Coalition, is that the RBA in 2018 found that if you increased the housing supply by 1%, it decreases housing costs by 2.5%. As we'll see when we discuss Auckland in approximately 2 minutes, when you do a large-scale zoning reform, it tends to get adopted and that drives rents down substantially. So the other thing is sustainability. So we've made the decision as a city that we're not going to sprawl out that much. Canberra is one of the least dense cities on the face of the earth, so it makes sense from my point of view. Every house that we do not build within the existing footprint is another house that we need to construct on the urban fringe. That means longer, and that it's real costs. So every house that we put further out on the extreme edge of Tuggeranong or King Island means higher commuting times. It also means a lot more costs in infrastructure. So these are our 3 pillars about why we're as an organisation doing it. Like, well, proposing this as reform. So let's go to the next slide. Cool. So Auckland in 2016 actually did a more radical version of what we're proposing. So Auckland merged their 7 regional council, like 7 local government areas into one super government, like local government to cover the entire metro. That meant that they needed a new territory, like their equivalent of a new territory plan. And the national government pretty much said that it needed to find a way of solving the housing crisis in Auckland as part of that. I'm doing my best not to butcher this. Gary Blake, who is the Auckland chief economist, gave a very interesting speech in New South Wales last week, and I'm going to do a poor imitation of that. But what eventually happened is 6 years later, when they introduced the Auckland Unitary Plan, they upzoned 75% of the city. So they replaced, except in heritage areas, their equivalent of RZ1 with something that for us would sit at about RZ3. So this included replacing most of what they called of their former single family home zone with what they called the mixed house suburban zone, which allowed gets a bit loose, but it allowed for higher density kind of between RZ2 and RZ3. So let's go to the next one. And this is in practice what has been built. The problem with showing people new photos of brand new homes like this is that the trees are very small and they look very new. Just imagine them with larger trees as time will wear on. But there are homes like this going up all over Auckland at the moment. And so if we just skip on to the next slide. This is when the plan came in. So the Auckland Unitary Plan created a massive surge in multi-unit housing development in Auckland, which is important because I'm not sure how many people here were familiar, but in the middle of the 2010s, Auckland had the worst housing affordability in the Western world, just about. Extremely low high rates and extremely low rates of affordability. And when they liberalised their planning system in a similar manner to what we did, the amount of housing construction went up. And then secondly, next slide, the rents went down. So important thing about this slide is that this graph is they're all coded to 0 being what they were in 2016. So what we can see is that Auckland's rents have risen at about the same rate as inflation. And the rest of New Zealand's, particularly Auckland, which did not go through, like particularly Wellington, which did not go through a similar zoning reform, grew a lot higher. I'm going to butcher the pronunciation here, but a team of researchers from the University of Auckland, Greenway McGurvey, just going to take that, effectively looked at this in detail in a peer-reviewed journal, determined via effectively comparing from what Auckland would otherwise be if the zoning reform had not gone through, that rents would have been about 32% higher for 3-bedroom homes had the zoning reforms not happened. So the amount of reductions in rents in Auckland as a direct result of this policy has been very substantial. So if we just go to the next slide. So that's what motivated us at Greater Canberra, the academic evidence around affordability, around reduced carbon emissions, around environmental conservation, and around the benefits of being able to live in a denser suburb. Grattan themselves found when they asked this question that most people when faced with the trade-offs associated with expense and commute times, would like to live in a townhouse or a terrace in the inner city suburb rather than a detached home on the edge. But why did we pursue this package of reforms rather than something else? And RZ2 isn't an ideal zone, but it's a zone that exists, and that is important, because the problem with when you try to come up with new zones on the fly is that you end up creating a whole load of problems. Okay, so I'm being told to hurry up by my team, so I will. So if we just go to the next slide. So just quickly, one of the other elements, and this is important, is we're also trying to get an exempt development pathway for low impact density homes, things like townhouses and terraces. Currently in the ACT, if you build a mansion, it's exempt development. You do not require development application. Doesn't matter how large it is. It can be a 4,000 square metre block and have a 13-car garage and forest. You don't need to do a development application for it. And because you don't need to do a development application for it, no one can sue you in ACAT, which is currently what is allowed. In the ACT at the moment, small townhouse developments are brought to the tribunal by their neighbours all the time. And this is a major disincentive to people doing that. So we want to do quite a similar thing to what New South Wales tried to do by creating a pathway through exemplar designs by saying if you build quite similar to this design for a townhouse or a terrace, it's compliant development and you don't need to do a DA. So just next slide. Okay, so just very quickly, in terms of how much housing we think this will create. There are around 97,000 RZ1 blocks in the ACT. If we apply the RZ2 pattern on top of it, then we get around 80,000 dwelling increase within design capacity from the RZ1 to RZ2 change without block consolidation. There are 9,000 RZ2 blocks, harder to estimate due to the fact that the exact number of dwellings that can be built on them is a product of the design guides. So next slide. Just quickly on why block consolidation changes this number. Two separate 900 square metre blocks could each be developed into duplexes, but if they're next to each other and you combine them into one 1,800 square metre block, then you can turn that into a row of 6 dwelling houses, of 6 houses. That's intentional. It's designed to encourage block consolidation. But that's why that 80,000 number is a bit rubbery. It goes up if there's not block consolidation. Next slide. Cool. This is an example in Red Hill, just in Export Street. Someone like a developer has bought and consolidated number 37 and number 35, and as a result has been able to build 5 townhouses there rather than the 4 that would otherwise be permitted. Cool. So just very quickly blasting through this, when we came up with this idea, we were very fortunate to be joined by a wide range of other organisations within the ACT that shared our vision for how we could make the city better by adopting this platform of reforms. We're going to be hearing from someone shortly in the panel. And the important thing is that we came together from entirely different perspectives and reasons in any case. The motives of master builders for supporting this particular platform of changes was quite different than the motives of the Conservation Council, but we had shared ground and we want to talk more about that shared ground in the panel. Right, next one. I am trying to get through this very quickly, team. I do apologise. So as you may have heard, in September 2023, the government came out with a new RZ1 policy. So just next slide. So the RZ1 policy is effectively a watered down version of what we're asking for. So the second dwellings permitted on blocks of over 800 square metres and it can be unit titled, which currently isn't the case. The second dwelling must be below 120 square metres. Blocks still cannot be subdivided or combined into new blocks, so they can be unit titled. And a DA is required, which means that ACAT appeal rights are still available, which means you can either decide when redeveloping a block if the old house has been knocked down or is unviable to build one very large house and not have to go through a DA process, or you build 2 houses, one of which is quite small, and you are at risk of the development being held up for a year or more in the tribunal by an angry neighbour. Which our problem has always been with this policy, not that it isn't a good marginal step in and of itself, it's that there's all these weird planning barriers that makes it so that we think that the amount of take-up is going to be very low. So, and again, we have the old rules for parking spaces. Next slide. Yeah, so around 42,000 blocks qualify for the new RZ1 policy. We say 42,000, That's the number of which we kind of reached in the ballpark for. It's hard to tell because there are what are called non-standardised F1 blocks, which throw the number off. The government said $45,000 on Monday and then $50,000 today. So if you know how they got that nurse, please tell us. But 42,000 is from a partner organisation that works with planning. However, because of all these barriers to creation, we anticipate the take up to be quite low. And the barriers which we had as part of the Missing Middle platform was solved. So, yeah. Just quickly, I'm not promised not to get into lease variation charges too much, but if you want to vary a lease or allow an additional dwelling in the city, you need to pay money to the ACT government. In some cases, that can be between $200,000 to $300,000, $500,000 in terms of expenditure. Right. So the bottom line of why all this matters is the ACT government is currently estimating that they need to have 150,000 or so homes, 150, in order to meet the expanded population demand. And the problem is that currently, under existing capacity, there's only up to 60,000 on current plans that they run out. They have change areas that gets them up to maybe an additional 35,000 if they're quick. But in order to actually get to meet the population demand coming up, you need to add a lot of additional housing capacity, and the RZ1 policy proposed doesn't go down far enough to meet that demand in a practical way. Right. So thank you for standing and bearing with me through that. I'm sorry if I mentioned any details. So just to introduce, now that I'm done speaking, I will be moderating, but I promise not to moderate you the way that I'm. So I'm joined by my wonderful panel here today, who in 3 cases are from member organisations in this sort of coalition, and then also Rob Henry, who is an architect who's worked on the demonstration housing project with Blackwood Hills Medium Density Developments in Canberra. And I'm also joined by Dr. Simon Copland, who is the Executive Director of Pedal Power ACT, Jenny Edwards, who is the Director of Lighthouse Architecture and Science, and also John from Better Entity. Okay, so if people just want to sit down. If you do have burning questions, I promise there will be a Q&A section coming up shortly. So don't worry, you will still be able to ask questions. And if you all right. So let's get us kicked off. I've explained kind of what Missing Middle Canberra is, and I just wanted to go around to our panelists, or at least the 3 panelists who are member organisations, and potentially Rob, if you want to say a few words as well, just about why you supported this change, and from your organisation's perspective, why it's a positive vision.
For me, it genuinely is because I am the parent of 3 young adults, and they are all out there trying to find places to live. I also have a staff of 17, and several of those staff are also young professionals struggling to find places to live, to rent, or to try and break into the market. So very, very personal motivation. But in addition to that, at Lighthouse, we quite regularly get approached by people who live in these established suburbs on great big blocks, who may already have an empty nest, and who want to do something clever with their block because they've got kids and they can see the issues that are coming. But again, because of all the planning regulation and the particular issues that Howard's already pointed out, they usually can't do what they thought they could. So, yeah, that's one reason.
Skipping here on, okay. So I'm from Pedal Power, and for those of you who don't know, Pedal Power is Canberra's kind of oldest and largest cycling and active travel organisation. We promote active travel in Canberra, and we do so for lots of reasons. One of the big ones is it's better for people's health, obviously, but also 60% of Canberra's carbon emissions are from transport now, after we've addressed a lot of the energy sector issues. And we know that, and the government has said quite openly, that we cannot rely on a transition to electric vehicles to address those carbon emissions problems. We have to have active public transport. And the bottom line is that it is much easier to walk and ride somewhere if you live close to that place. So it's really hard when you live in the outer suburbs to be able to ride into work. It's really hard to ride to the shops because it's actually too far away. We know from research that people are most likely to ride and walk distances that are under 5 kilometres. And so we want to create a city which most of your services, your work, your employment, your health, your education can be within that radius. Other cities around the world are talking about a 15-minute city. And what that means is that you can ride or walk or catch public transport to everything you need within 15 minutes. And so we need density to make that happen. We really need density to make that happen. That's why we've supported the campaign.
Great, thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Joel. I'm from Better Renting and also a big fan of the campaign. And I think what it comes down to from thinking about interests of renters here is I'm sure many renters have that experience of you go along to an inspection and there's 30 other people there and you're queuing up. And there's a pretty terrible ratio of people needing a place to rent to places to rent available. And sometimes I watch films in other countries and someone's looking for a place to rent and the agent takes them and shows them 3 empty properties and says, take your pick. And I'd love to see that in Canberra. It would be a wildly different time of people looking to rent. But I think it would also be a wildly different time of people who already have a rental. Because we've seen rental reform in Canberra, but that reform is less effective because landlords still have so much market power and vacancy rates for rentals are still so low. And no one really wants to stand up for their rights because they don't want to risk a bad reference or struggling to find another place. And I just love to think how much all the stuff that you can't legislate would go differently if we had a vacancy rate of 5% and landlords knew if their property were empty, they'd struggle to fill it. That's the word I want.
And I might jump in, although my name's not up on the supporters list. There's a couple of reasons for that, but I just want to start just to clarify, I'm a local architect, but I'm also the executive director of the Institute of Architects of the ACT. So I've kind of got 2 hats on tonight in this discussion, and anything that's related to the Institute, I'll try and say the Institute, just for clarity. Personally, I'm very supportive of this, and I was part of the demonstration housing project, which I'm sure we'll talk about shortly. But it's been a long journey for both myself and for the Institute of Architects looking at density in our city. And I've just, in preparation for this today, I actually just did a bit of a timeline of events for that, and I'd just like to share that because I think it's kind of shocking. In 2008, I was personally involved in a project with Tate Network and Melinda Dodson, architect, called the Coombs Demonstration Housing Precinct, which was going to be a test case for density in our city. It did not go ahead. In 2013, the Institute advocated for housing choice. In 2014, the Institute was able to put forward a competition of sorts called the New Experimental Housing Typologies competition. Melinda Dodson happened to be the winner of that, and I happened to be the runner-up, but it was actually a nationally run competition. In 2014, Mick Gentleman became the planning minister. In 2015, I did a research tour of the UK of housing typologies and presented that to Mr. Gentleman. In 2016 and 2017, I was the ACT chapter president of the Institute of Architects, and I had something like 20 discussions with Minister Gentleman on housing choices. And we developed a housing choices website. In 2018, the minister came to me and said, I've got a great idea, let's do a demonstration housing project. I was calm in that meeting. That project occurred. 2018 was the initial launch of that, and I personally, personal hat on, entered 3 projects into it. All were successful. 4 years later, in 2022, 1 of those 3 projects managed to get through the variation to the territory plan process. Just 1. In 2023, the Institute of Architects consulted on the territory plan, and very little of that consultation was done, which led to anything of change in the new territory plan, which we have was implemented just 2 days ago. So why do I support this? Because we've been on such a ridiculous journey that something needs to happen. And I'm so delighted that Greater Canberra here
trying to do something.
Thank you, Rob. So full disclosure to everyone here, we formed as an organisation to support Rob's demonstration housing project, which was the Manor House in Griffith. So, and it feels like we've come a very long way, but has the VA even been filed for it? There are about 5 hoops which they've needed to jump through.
No. So the situation there is that the clients have been worn out entirely by the process. We've gone on what's now a 5-year journey for that, and received the most objections for a project in the ACT for this particular development from the Griffith Residents Association in majority.
So this gives you kind of you might wonder who would possibly spend a lot of time opposing being in, like, you know, a duplex in a suburb, but it turns out when you dig into it, a lot of people do. So one of my questions I did have for Rob was, you know, what did your experience in this process reveal about the challenges and what ones in addressing this kind of housing type, but like building this kind of housing typologies within RZ1 or Suburban Canberra?
Yeah, I might just start a little bit about what the project actually was, if that's okay. Groundbreaking stuff. It was called a manor house. It's been done all across the world and indeed the country. A manor house is a single building comprising typically 3 or 4 dwellings in it, no more than 2 stories in height, and each dwelling is typically attached to each other, whether it be through floor or wall. My project, when I started this demonstration housing thinking, was to comply with all the rules, except for the one thing: put more people on a block of land. So the manor house in Griffith is a single building. It comprises of 2 3-bedroom dwellings and 2 2-bedroom dwellings. All of the units were adaptable, so there's a lift provided, it being 2 stories. So every single one of those is adaptable, meeting good accessibility standards. Every single one of those had a shared services, as well as a communal garden and also their own private space. The design was under the 50% plot ratio, which is allowed for the site, so no rule broken there. The actual footprint of the house is over 30%. So 70% of the land was allocated for landscape zone. It was 2 stories, it fitted within the solar envelope, and it complied with all rules relating to overlooking and impact on neighbours' properties. Why would someone complain about that? The proposal was smaller and less intrusive than just a majority of houses sitting around it. At the time of lodging the proposal, we did a review of some other dwellings, and a house nearby was 600 square metres in size and floor area, included a 4 to 5 car basement garage, and housed 1 resident. This is 2 doors down. The manor house was smaller in size, had less car parking requirements, and could conservatively house about 14 residents, each with their own private open space. So that's the context of what we were doing. We went through a process of speaking to all the neighbours. Every single one of those neighbours said, "We like your proposal, it's a nice looking design, but we object to the idea of more people on this lot of land. Largely, we object to the amount of cars that are going to be coming to and from this site, even though the house 2 doors up the road had 5 cars sitting in its basement and we were proposing 4. I think that the biggest challenge that we have with this whole process is changes to the territory plan. It required its own individual variation to the territory plan, and that was a process of years to do. What we're talking about here today is something that allows this to just happen and not have changes to the territory plan. So I think that's the biggest challenge that we came across. Maybe thousands of letters to government objecting to it was also a challenge, but in fact there were quite a few supportive letters as well, and the government was able to reject the majority of letters of objection and move on.
So, Jenny, like, because I know Winehouse's background is working in how to make more energy efficient homes. So, what opportunities more energy efficient and environmentally friendly homes does this kind of zoning reform offer them?
Huge opportunity. You know, the number one thing you do if you're serious about sustainability and energy efficiency and livability is do a smaller footprint. Higher number of people in a smaller footprint. It just is it's a no-brainer. It's a win-win-win. And you know, my frustration, Lord, it's so strongly for Rob to hear that personal, the whole thing spelled out. But this is the problem that there is so much opposition, and we get approached by people who want to do this because they can see that it is the obvious thing to do. Yet the regulations prevent them. So we, to achieve this, have to do density by stealth. So we work within the planning regulations and do things that are actually two houses in and other things where, again, the regulations should be encouraging this, and there are so many people who are doing it. So that was a long-winded answer.
No, like, I don't think it was a long-winded answer. Might then throw to Joel, because I know one of the things that Better Renting frequently talks about is the challenges of, and I certainly felt it, I used to live in this tiny little unrenovated 1950s old house, and we froze every single winter. So do you have any thoughts about how these kind of reforms in the energy efficiency of new housing can present a better deal for Canberra and for Canberra's renters?
Yeah, so I guess there's two parts to how I think this can improve the experience of Canberra renters, particularly in winter, but also increasingly in summers. So one part of it, obviously, is that new dwellings are built to modern energy efficiency standards, which will be hopefully 7 stars by and large. And they're much more comfortable to live in and much cheaper to live in, and you hopefully have a lot less condensation. And the best rentals I've rented in Canberra have been relatively new built, high density dwellings. I lived in access apartments in Lynham. I don't know how it got up. I'm sure Planning Greater Canberra does, but it was good in winter. It was wild. I had to explain to people sort of astonishing. Actually, Canberra isn't a terrible place to live in winter. It's just the housing. So that was nice. And I think obviously when we've analysed rentals available for people in Canberra, about 40% get the lowest energy efficiency rating, and then you see another bump at 6 stars, and it's newly built dwellings that are by and large high density. And so the growth of energy efficient rental stock is going to come from letting it be built. But another part of this is all the renters who are stuck in these really poorly performing homes with no market power, who honestly even struggle to get the landlord to repair existing heating appliances. And I guess harking back to what I said earlier, reform like this can also be giving those renters more leverage and power of trying to get changes made or even basic repairs done to the existing housing stock that they're currently in.
Yes. Okay, thank you for that answer, Joel. If anyone wants to add anything, by the way, just feel free to jump in and ask for the microphone. But so kind of just moving on to Simon now. For many people, the link between this kind of density and zoning reform and active transport and particular cycling isn't immediately obvious. And I know you talked a little bit about it in your opening answer. But how would you kind of persuade people? Because we get a lot of people that when they talk about when they oppose housing or oppose any increase in density, the number one thing they talk about is that, oh, we don't mind it, but could you imagine all the cars parking on the street? And so from your perspective, how can this kind of reform allow for a future in which people don't need to drive and so there is less pressure in that direction?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. That's one that I've been asked a lot when we signed up to this as well. And it was something that people were concerned about, that it will actually increase our own members, that it will increase sort of car usage, and that will or traffic in particular areas, will make it more difficult for people to cycle. And I think part of it comes from the fact that Canberra is still a very car-based city, and people only have an imagination that cars are the only way we can get around. I get told, when I'm doing radio interviews, oh, Canberra's so cold, nobody would want to ride their bike anywhere. And I'm like, have you been to Europe? where people ride their bike all over the place. It's really stuck in our sort of psyche that cars are the only option we have. And this is possibly a controversial thing to say in Canberra, but maybe not in this room, but that's not a good thing. Cars are not they're not the saviour. They're actually extremely inefficient. They're extremely expensive to run. They take up a lot of space in our city, not just because of the roads, but also surface car parks. And as you were talking before, the car parks in houses, in apartment blocks, that takes up a lot of space in our city. And they're really bad in terms of pollution. And we're not just talking about carbon pollution, we're also talking about a whole range of other pollution, the pollution that comes from the constant upkeep of roads, the constant, even recent research has shown that just the pollution from tyres creates air pollution that kills people. And so there's a lot of problems with being a car-based city. Now, the thing that we kind of get pushed on, well, people love their cars. And so we just, this is what we're stuck with. We actually recently, when Katie Gallagher was opening a new car park in the Parliamentary Triangle, she said actively, people love their cars in Canberra, so this is why we're building a new multi-storey car park in the Parliamentary Triangle. But the research actually doesn't hold that out. So research shows, and there's research in Australia, which in Australia is kind of considered a car-based country, that shows that when people are asked around cycling in particular, that over 60% of people would be interested in cycling more, but are concerned about doing so. And they're concerned because they don't feel, there's two reasons generally people are concerned about doing so. One, they don't feel it's safe, because riding on roads, we have a lot of road-based cycling infrastructure and it's not particularly safe. And the second one is that people don't think it's convenient. It's not convenient to do so. And the convenience one is a real poor part. So if you live in the south of Tuggeranong, if you live in the north of Gungahlin and you work in the city, I agree, I wouldn't be riding into the city either. I would be stuck in my car. And so you kind of get in this situation where if that's the only place you can live, you become completely reliant on a car because it's the only way you can get around. So increasing density has this capacity to change our culture because it becomes easier to get around not in a car. And so what you see, and we see this where this happens around the world, is when you increase the density, and it has to be matched with increased infrastructure as well. You don't want to have a situation where you've got new apartments on North One Avenue and the only way you can ride into the city is down a North One Avenue with a painted, with infrastructure that is paint, which, we're relying on paint and hope that you won't get quite done. You have to have the better infrastructure as well that's matched with this. But if you have a greater density of people who are using it, then you have this capacity. People stop using their cars. And I have found this personally. When I stopped using my car, I realised it was this great sense of freedom because you don't get stuck in traffic jams anymore. Traffic jams are the worst. I hate them. And it's nice not to be there. I live in Gungahlin, and it's faster for me to ride to work in the city than it is to drive my car because I don't get stuck. I don't have to find parking. I don't have to pay for it. I don't have to pay for petrol. All these kinds of things. So there's great capacity if we can embrace it, and density is a core part of that.
Can I add to that? I'd just like to talk again about the Manhattan project. And so we, in that proposal, put 4 cars, one for each residence, 14 bicycle spots, and 4 motorbike cycle spots in that development. The location of that, there are 2 good buses that you can collect and take you wherever. There's walking distance to the local shops, the Grievous shops, pretty much walking distance to Marnica, pretty much walking distance to the Fishwick markets, and then a bike ride over to Kingston shops. People living there don't need the cars. They really don't, and they don't want it. And one of these things is that the owners themselves, they've lived there the whole time with 1 car. So I think the point with car parking is it's going to be variable across our city, and it's going to take time to change. But in the inner suburbs, where there is good public transport, there is proximity, to local shops from walking distance or cycling, it's a no-brainer that we need less car spaces. And then maybe in the outer suburbs, we're going to have to rely on them more until, public transport improves. And that's why I think the rule actually needs to be flexible, and it shouldn't be mandated to 2 car spaces per dwelling. That's madness. But for the time being, there should be some requirement, but certainly minimised. And then also, it's important to think about the future of buildings and actually make sure those car spaces can be transformed into something else. So that if we're building multi-storey, car parks in the parliamentary triangle, which in itself is crazy, instead of doing the light rail through there, but that's another subject. But if we're doing that, we're actually thinking that building in 10, 20, 30 years is going to be transformed into an office building or a residential building or something like that, so that we're not having to tear down a car park building and build something else.
Just a quick anecdote on that. I think this is what we're seeing in Europe, in particular in Paris, where there has been a massive transition to active transport in the last 10 to 15 years, where the local government has invested heavily in active transport. Again, a cold city, a place that also gets very hot, very dense. I was there in 2019 and could see the transformation happening as they were closing roads to build cycling lanes. And one of the things that's happening now is they're transforming car parks because they're no longer used. And so car parks, they have some troubles with them because of the heights. So you can't transform into houses and things like that. But what they're doing is they're actually now, some car parks have been transformed as storage spaces and actually also storage spaces for bicycle courier services. So bicycle courier services are becoming a replacement for driving courier services, and it's much safer there because everybody rides. So bicycle courier services in Australia are actually very dangerous because people have to ride on roads, and there's quite a high death rate because of this. But when everyone's starting to ride, it becomes much safer, and these kind of car parks are being transformed into the kind of warehouses where people pick up their goods and take them out.
I do move my microphone to avoid feedback problems, so sorry for that pause. But just turning now to Rob and Jenny, and I want to get both your perspectives on this. I did talk a little bit about the RZ1 policy from my perspective, and I come at it from a very policy wonk kind of perspective. But within each of your professions, what is the take on the RZ1 policy announced by the government?
Go for it.
I have some stats. Putting my Institute of Architects hat on now, we put in a submission to the territory plan, and since then have been doing a little bit more work in that space and actually looking at the challenges in the RZ1 zoning related to the new territory plan. I've done assessments on a few different suburbs throughout Canberra, Hackett, Scullen and McGregor, I think, were 3 of note. So looking at inner north, looking at Balcon and then looking at Tuggeranong. So trying to get a broader picture to actually look at the figures that we're going to achieve. So the RZ1 changes. When it first started, the Minister gentleman suggested 35,000 blocks were eligible for this, that were over 800 square metres. That crept up to 40, recently 45, and I'm gobsmacked that it's now 50 because those figures just aren't true. The assessment that we went through and looking at that, and I might actually just pull out my figures through here. So Hackett, 5% of blocks we think has an infill capacity, which is actually 57 blocks. So in three suburbs that we did, there were 1,457 blocks, and only 155 of those actually have the ability to be modified. So so we were looking at Hackett around 5%, Gowrie 4%, Scullen 6% of total blocks that are 800 square metres or more actually having the ability to be changed.
So when you hear 45,000 or 50,000 of those, think about 5% of that. So I did the 5% calculation on 45,000, which is 2,250. So the basis of this is looking at the current conditions of these blocks of land, and then actually visually inspecting each of those blocks, that took us a while, and going, is it actually feasible to put another dwelling on this site? And there are many reasons why this isn't the case. The setbacks, the inability to get through into the backyard to create that extra car space, large trees on site that are significant trees. There's a whole range of things that we came up with. So we reviewed it block by block and whittled it down to 5% as a conservative figure. So it's pretty scary to think about that. Then we overlay other situations, other things to this, and we look at affordability and land cost and lease variation charges and etc. And actually, when we look at it, quite a lot of these blocks that are going to be eligible are in Tuggeranong and Belconnen, where land values are less and where banks are less likely to allow a loan of a certain amount of money. And I think that we could easily say of that 5%, 50% of that is going to be ineligible because of affordability. So we're looking, in my conservative figures, of 1,225 blocks in the ACT that's actually probably might, if someone wants to actually do it, be able to be developed with an extra dwelling.
And then if 20% get through the ACAP process, we're talking about tens of dwellings.
We're talking about tens of dwellings. That's exactly right. And then, so it was interesting. You put up the figure of 145,000-ish dwellings that are required by 2050. The ACT government told me just a couple of weeks ago that was 100,000. So maybe there's a growth in that or something. I don't know what's going on. To get a population of 695,000 by 2050, that's the expected population. So we need to, on that alone, if we're just looking at 100, not 140 that you're picking up on, but 100,000, we're looking at needing 3,700 dwellings per year, every year, to get to that. In 2021, just new blocks released was 966. I'm looking at something that they're saying 45,000 blocks, and we've got maybe 1,000 of those being eligible. So without significant reform, further reform, I don't even want to use an expletive here, but I feel like I should, we're in trouble. Yeah.
Deep shit, Rob. Yeah, look, I haven't got exact stats, but I can tell you, Lighthouse specialises in small footprint sustainability, energy efficiency. So we have people contacting us to do this stuff. The RZ1 announcement was made, and we've had several people reach out to us, but it's becoming very obvious each time we look at their block, if we apply the setbacks and the parking requirements and the various issues, that bugger all of them are actually going to be able to do anything. And the affordability, as Rob's touched on, is a big issue. Some people have got a smaller house on a big block and seem to have this huge backyard they can work with. They don't realise they don't actually have a huge backyard to work with. And to actually achieve anything on their site, they would have to demolish their existing house. And a lot of these people don't want to demolish their existing house. They want to do something clever toward the rear of their block, and they simply can't. So it's a dodo piece of legislation. It's really disappointing. It's not going to achieve much at all, and we have to lobby hard to have it changed.
Just to clarify a few things from that, the figure about 150,000 is from the government's new district strategies. So that was a screenshot taken from that. So that's the ACT government saying that, not us. We think that estimate is actually conservative. So between the 2011 through to 2021 censuses, the ACT was the fastest growing, or the second fastest growing city in what we might call the Anglosphere after Austin and Texas, if we discount a bunch of American cities that are kind of part of bigger cities that are called things like Palm Springs. So we put on 100,000 people or so between 2011 and 2021, a growth rate of about 2.4% per year. If we keep up that rate of growth, then we need about 50,000 dwellings every decade. That means that we actually end up through to 2050 at about that 150 through to also number. But if the rate stays steady and the absolute increase actually is higher between 2031 through to 2041 than it was 20 years beforehand, which seems likely, then we could very easily need 170 through to 200,000 dwellings. And this reveals the problem, because we currently do not have a plan that will get us to anywhere near that number. So, just turning now to Simon and John. So, I am quite active on the website formerly known as Twitter. And one thing that, because I talk a lot about planning reform and zoning reform and creating houses in this kind of way, and a lot of people do come back at me and say, well, for all these questions, particularly around housing affordability and other things, what about all these other things that we could do that would also create better circumstances for renters? What about all these other things? And often it's presented as if there's this kind of tension between doing planning reform and doing tenancy reform, and other things about this tension between doing things that improve active transport take-up in terms of infrastructure and doing planning reform to allow for more houses in that footprint. Do you kind of have a perspective on if there's this tension between these two different policy approaches?
Yeah, I do have some thoughts, in fact. I mean, on paper, I think it is worth acknowledging that some governments do play games, and they'll sort of do one thing instead of the other. And, you know, for them it's quite a political question. I do think it's worth recognising that. I think it is actually really important for all the different perspectives to sort of have a fairly consistent all of the above approach here, and not to sort of be one-eyed about sort of the supply side response to this. And it's just unfortunately a reality about the politics. But I think also, I guess, coming at this, having done a lot of work in rental reform, I think there's a real complementarity here. And I think, I mean, I've spoken about that a bit earlier today, but if we look at something like a rent regulation, which we have in a weak form in the ACT, and which we'd like to see in a stronger form in every jurisdiction, that's very politically difficult when you have constrained housing supply, and there's actually like this sort of market rent that's really high and which landlords can't tap into. And you do see all sorts of funny games happening where there's lots of black market in the rent, there's lots of black market letting and things going on to try to get around that. Where you can actually have rent regulation or rent control work really well is where you also have the market rent not growing at 10% per year. You have other measures that are actually making so that market rent isn't so big and it's complementing the regulation there. And I think that sort of is the bigger picture here, making these things work together. We don't want governments to be zeroing in on just one of them is going to be the solution. We don't want to be doing that ourselves, but I do think there's a wonderful all of the above approach. I actually think the ACT government, despite this quite stuffed up effort with the planning reform thus far, is pursuing a range of measures that work together. And I think you're seeing the fruits of that in rental conditions in the ACT. Maybe not improving, but certainly not getting bad, it's getting worse at the rate we're seeing in other jurisdictions. And so I think that let's do it all.
I have a few thoughts about this. I want to just reflect on this Z1 announcement that was made first. It really speaks to me through my involvement in doing work with the ACT government, that one of the things that I think that they try to do quite frequently is make big announcements but not actually do anything. There's a lot of plans, there's a lot of strategies, there's a lot of things, but they don't want to upset people for some reason. They're the most the government has been in power for 22 years. They're probably the most stable government in the country that's ever existed. Yet they're so terrified about upsetting particular groups. In my work, it's car drivers, the angry people on Facebook. I think in this area, it's the community councils. For some reason, they're super upset, so they do these half measures that achieve nothing. And this is quite a common trend that I see across the ACT government. It's really frustrating. And when we're looking at the need to get enough housing stock to address the population growth that we're seeing, it's just not good enough. It's really not good enough. So that's my first side rant. The second part I want to say is, I think on this tension, I think one of the things that you're possibly alluding to as well, Howard, is the kind of tension between these kind of market-based approaches and the tension with public housing. And this is something that I know I've raised with you. It's not coming from my work perspective, but coming from other areas of my interests, that we cannot have, I believe we can't have a solution where it's just planning reform, and I don't think Verity Canberra wants that, but we also need to be looking at investment in public housing. The Australian government, the ACT government, well, it wasn't the ACT government at the time, if you look back in the 50s, 60s and 70s, investment in public housing was huge in this country. If you came to Canberra as a public servant, you got a house. That was how it worked. You got given a public house as a public servant. And for many years, teachers, nurses, all these kind of professions got public housing. That's what all the blocks were on Northland Avenue that have just been demolished. And we have seen a systemic underinvestment in public housing from successive governments, ACT, federal, state governments across the country. And we need to see this work together with greater investment in public housing. And I don't think anyone here disagrees with that, but I think it's important to have that as part of the conversation. We need the government to be building housing again. We need to the government to be building masses of housing again. And one of the problems is the ACT government isn't doing that. We had a commitment in 2020 after the election for 400 additional public houses in the ACT, and we have not been able to meet that target. It's pathetic, it's really pathetic. And I know part of the problem is that if you want to, and I know Verity Canberra has been campaigning on this, and it's been one of the great things I've been saying is that the government also has problems with ACAT disputes around public housing. When the ACT government tries to build public housing, local groups come in and try to stop that from happening. And the way the government could change that is just changing the laws. They have the power to do that. Yes, we can complain about government, we can complain about those community groups, but it's actually the government's fault for not addressing this issue, because they could just change the legislation and to make it easier so that you cannot have these kind of spurious appeals against public housing developments. It's slowing down the uptake of public housing in the ACT.
So,
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. We've been talking about housing crisis in more recent times, but honestly, we've picked up with the Institute hat on housing crisis, for at least 10 years ago, and nothing's really happened of that. And what happens when there's a housing crisis? We have more people living on the streets. We have more people in public housing, and the numbers just aren't keeping up with that. I want to keep my Institute hat on and say, though, we've been quite critical of the RZ1 zoning reform. I actually think that the new territory plan has a lot of good in it. There's a lot of strategies in that which will help us move forward in lots of different areas. And I think it's important to note that there's a huge body of work that's been done with that, which will hopefully have positive change in our city. We're actually doing okay as a city. We're doing pretty well. But in terms of this topic tonight, that's what we're most agitated about.
We're doing okay if you're not a young person looking for somewhere to live.
So just to quickly provide some more detail about what's going on with what was alluded to in public housing, one of the campaigns that we tried to do as Greater Canberra was that we were noticing that every single public housing triplex in certain suburbs was being sued by the Local Residents Association and ACAT. If you're hearing about the Griffith and Narrabundah Community Association again, there's a reason for that. They're the ones we're talking about. And it was in part because ACT Housing had a special concession or has special concession under the planning laws to build multi-unit dwellings in RZ1 provided that they meet a certain standard of accessibility. And what is happening currently is that because they are building a multi-unit dwelling, they need to get a DA, and that means that neighbours can challenge it, and they do. ACT Housing ends up in ACAT all the time, and it's one of the main drags on the effectiveness of that organisation. And part of our motives in proposing this planning reform is the largest single RZ1 landholder in the ACT is ACT Housing. So ACT Housing would gain the ability to build a lot more housing virtually overnight without needing to buy any additional land via this reform.
sorry, I feel like I'm being a bit of a hog tonight, but just on that very point. So there was a particular project that went through ACAT with ACT housing in a particular suburb that I'm not very fond of their residents association. And that has actually led to some changes internally with ACT housing. And I was involved in a project in another suburb and ACT, and I did some concept designs for that to illustrate that we could get 3 to 4 dwellings on that block of land. And ACT Housing rejected that and said, no, we just can't go through ACAT anymore. So on this, I can't remember if it was 14 or 1600 square metre block of land, they are building 1 dwelling and 1 secondary dwelling.
Ooh.
So that is not a very good use of the ACT government land, just to get around a particular rule that they could actually change.
Noting that the secondary dwelling has to be less than 90 square metres, so it's crazy. You know, that's the other thing, we haven't really made that point strongly, that blocks larger than 800 square metres are often significantly bigger than, some of them are significantly bigger than 800 square metres and can easily fit 3 or 4. You know, limiting it to 2 is just crazy.
All right, I've got my microphone back. So with that, we might just bring the panel discussion to a close. Could you all please join me in thanking them? And with that, I did promise questions, so questions we will do. Joined by Jin, who will be distributing the question asking microphone. Oh, you'll take one. Sorry?
We've got one online if you want to read.
Okay, so what we might do is we might start one from the audience. So I might go to one here, then we'll go to one online, then we'll just keep going around.
Hi, my name is Wendy Hayhurst. I'm CEO at the Community Housing Industry Association. So I very much welcome the fact that we ended up by talking about social and affordable housing. And if we can move away first from just speaking about public housing, because you've got 3 members up there who support community housing, you've got 2 community housing organisations. So the terminology is social and affordable housing. So please talk about that, because you know, we do fully support what you're doing. It'd be good to see Cheer up there. We'll be very happy to join you. But in your ask, it would be, I think, really great if you could also say a percentage of housing needs to be social and affordable. You could do all that great work and still, the lowest income people in Canberra, they will still not be able to afford a home. We're exporting people to Queanbeyan at the moment. That's where people are being housed. So social and affordable housing, not public housing, because it includes both types of accommodation, and a percentage in those areas that are upzoned need to be socially affordable housing.
Okay, I think that was your statement.
Strongly support that statement, and noting the move to Queanbeyan and across the border in Queanbeyan, where they've now just relaxed the planning regulations so they can do more medium density housing, so we're going to lose more.
Right. Oh, the online question. Yes, that has probably been messaged to me via our Discord, and I will just have a look at that. So this is the one from Dungeon. Okay, this is from, and I'm going to absolutely butcher how to pronounce this, and I apologise in advance, from Dunja Kazmeric. I love high density, but it's hard retrofitting it to a city that was specifically designed not to be built like that. How will infrastructure challenges be addressed? Won't town centre a case in point?
I think Rob and I would argue that it's not hard. I mean, again, with good design, I think there's plenty of opportunity in this city to do higher density around. I've lived around Woden for a long time. I lived in Curtin and around that area. It might not be a great town centre, but it's being improved. But if you look at the suburbs around there, there's huge potential.
Well, I think what we're talking about tonight is, what we've largely talked about tonight is a change to RZ1. And so what we're talking about there isn't high density, it's actually medium density. And I think the demonstration housing project, of which several architects are involved in, illustrated that you could actually do that with literally no change to the footprint or to the streetscape and still fit more people in houses should people want to develop that way. So you can build a house that's 600 square metres and have one person in it, or you can build that and have 14 people in it. I think that we're going to do that. We've got other regulations that are driving that. Tree canopy cover and things like that, which is really good initiatives that have been introduced into the territory plan. We can keep our garden city and increase density. As far as town centres, I think the government is doing good work in public transport and things like that to accommodate that through the city. Gungahlin was kind of the testing ground into the city, and once the light rail heads out to Woden, it's a good thing.
I want to add, I think, the garden city component, I think the only way we can keep having a garden city is by increasing density in our city. And the reality is that if we don't increase our density, we're going to just be destroying more and more bushland in this city. And that's what we don't want. And in fact, there's a great capacity. People talk about their own gardens. I think we should also be talking about what's the benefit of communal gardens, communal spaces, communal green space. I actually think an obsession with your own personalised garden is quite selfish when lots of people don't get access to that. And yeah, it's nice to have your huge, great big garden in the backyard. What's nicer is a big park that everyone can share. And there's much greater capacity of big parks everyone can share when you have a denser city.
Which also goes to, I'm just going to name one particular area, is the curtain horse paddocks.
Yeah.
So, that is a perfect place for densification. Why on earth in the city centre, right on the proposed light rail path, do we have a horse paddock? So I think we can do it, and we can create that area to keep these garden city principles, but put more people in our city and not on the very edges of the city where we can't get the public transport to them.
This goes to supporting light rail stage 2, and that's a whole other question in terms of all the weird and wonderful blocks there are to actually doing light rail stage 2 in a reasonable period of time. And we do have and we'll just go to questions now. And maybe just the spiky haired gentleman at the back.
Travis Gilbert, I manage ACT Shelter, so we signed up to the Missing Middle quite early on because we've been unable to convince Minister Gentleman that it matters. Following on from what Wendy said, we commissioned AHURI, the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, to do some work for us for 2021, and it found that there was a shortage of 5,500 properties in the ACT affordable to people earning less than $800 a week. We find so much opposition to anything that looks like supportive or affordable housing. We now have an opportunity with the Commonwealth that is providing funding for 1,200 affordable submarket, 74.9% of market rent, or income-based public or social tenancies. And we have the ACT government telling the Commonwealth that it may not be able to meet that target of 1,200 properties over 5 years. How myopic is that? And would you, in your right mind, tell a Commonwealth that is offering you tens of millions of dollars that you may not be able to meet a pretty pitiful target like 250 properties a year?
I would go with very myopic. No, I wouldn't tell the Commonwealth.
We might just go to Vermont.
Thank you so much.
My question is mostly to the architects on the panel. As part of the suite of the planning reforms that the government introduced, they dropped a whole series of design guides. I had a bit of a flick through them. A lot of them seem very granularly prescriptive about all the things that developers have to consider in order to have a good development. Do you think these prescriptive design guides make it easier or more difficult to build housing in Canberra?
I think the proof is in the next 6 to 12 months. Hopeful that things will be easy. Hopeful that approval processes are easier. It's really, really hard to know, I think. One of the good things is, though, I think that should things not work out or as planned by the ACT government, that it is going to be easier going forward to make changes to this sort of stuff. My understanding of the district strategies is there's, you know, some quick things that we can do now, some things that we might be able to do in 5 years, and some things that we might be able to do in 10 years. It's kind of that approach. There's someone else in the audience here that could help me on this question, but I won't go to her. But yeah, I think it's really hard to get your head around a whole new, you know, framework for the city. It's going to be really difficult for architects and designers to go through their developments over the next 6 months. But so I think to give benefit of the doubt and let it happen. And that's probably not the answer that you wanted, but I think that's what needs to happen.
I should stress I'm not actually an architect. Lighthouse Architecture and Science does architecture. There are 2 architects on my team are here today, but I'm actually a scientist. But we've been looking at it a lot, and again, we're remaining optimistic. From our perspective, not a lot has changed, and the only thing that the structure's different, and we are optimistic that it will make some things easier. The only thing we're disappointed with is the RZ1 stuff at the moment. But like Rob said, hopefully from here it's the start of a smooth and better evolution.
The only thing I suppose that would add from my perspective is that it can't really be understated that at the moment no one really knows how the new planning system will work. And the reason for that is that at the end of the day, what happens is that a development application goes in, the directorate makes a decision about whether it's compliant or not, and then if the person is not happy with that, they'll take it to ACAT, who traditionally has a very different interpretation than the planning directorate on many matters in the old planning system, and there was a lot of friction there. We don't think that's going to go away. So the next 12 months is where we find out what actually the new planning system will mean in effect, because at the moment it's dependent on what ACAT decides in a series of precedent setting decisions about what all this actually means. And at the moment, we don't know.
I think when we're looking at the broader territory planning, I think quite a lot of organisations seem to be supportive of the broader changes. But quite a few organisations aren't supportive of RZ1. And that's why we're talking about that tonight. And why there is a territory plan review process going on next week, and a couple of days next week, isn't it? The Institute of Architects will be up there talking about the very topics we're talking about tonight. And the hope is with that review process is that we might be able to make some quick changes to RZ1 now that might have some impact. So it might not be changing it to RZ2, in fact it won't be, but we might be able to include more typologies within RZ1. That's what we really do need to see. So instead of single dwelling or dwelling in a secondary dwelling, is there any flexibility to do some duplexes, townhouse type developments on those blocks of land? And I know the Institute of Architects put forward those ideas, and EBSDD reviewed those ideas, but somewhere at higher levels, I suspect it got knocked back. And I know what's happened, but I'm not going to tell you.
Right, any further questions? What can you do that?
Hi, my name's Catherine Townsend. I'm the Assistant Government Architect, and I'm very pleased to be in the audience today and hear your proposition. And I'll just respond to the gauntlet that very gently threw down, and to respond to the question about the housing design guides. I want to say up front that I did not have a lot of input into the planning, but I have had quite a lot of input into the urban design guide and the housing design guide. And the purpose of those design guides is to actually deliver livable environments. So under the planning regime that disappeared on Monday, so under the past planning regime, it was quite legal for developers to build blocks of units with completely internalised bedrooms. I think that's unconscionable. I don't think that doesn't respect human rights. That developers think it's okay for a family to bring up their children in a bedroom with no window. So the housing design guide addresses aspects like that. The housing design guide talks about minimum floor-to-floor heights. And so what's the point of that? That's not for pure loveliness. That's to facilitate natural ventilation. That's so you don't have to rely on air conditioning. And that's so that you can actually install a ceiling fan. And the housing design guide talks about natural ventilation, about having external shading. The fundamental characteristics of what makes a place habitable, what makes a place livable. It's not just a slot to pass 10 years of your life. It's where we live, and it's got to have habitable characteristics. So the housing design guide has two parts. It has the first part, which explains why it has certain characteristics, and then the second part, which is a technical specification, and it sets down metrics. And I acknowledge that it's not going to be an easy transition, but it's absolutely putting the challenge to the development community of this is how it should be done to provide equitable, livable housing. And it's modelled on the New South Wales SEP 65. So there's 23 years of actual testing. Nobody's died yet. No big developers have gone bust yet. It's actually proven to work to get better outcomes.
I do love that we have so many incredible stakeholders in the audience which bring such expertise, and really appreciate that. But for future questions, can we please make sure that if they are questions, again, I really do appreciate your expertise and feel that it added a lot to the question. We might just go to Deputy next.
Thank you, Howard. Thank you, panel. The slide you showed earlier of the tremendous success of transit-oriented development along Lower Rail Stage 1 with that RC3 residential, just clustered that kind of red. I'd really like to see that emulated out as far as Tuggeranong along the known light rail routes that we have now. How does the panel feel if the government, instead of having non-ambitious sort of transport corridor study that was released last year for light rail stage 2 to Woden, if the government put regulations in place just to allow that RZ3 medium density in that corridor right along the known light rail routes now and not in future? How does the panel think that something like that would help Canberra's housing crisis?
Right, what work from Jenny or Ross?
I think it'd be great.
I think there's merit in it. I think we need to actually look at things on a case-by-case basis. And there might be heritage sensitivities or social sensitivities and things like that that come into play. So I don't think that you can just go, yep, we're just going to do this across, the whole city without some further thought around those things. But in principle, yes, it would help. But so too with so many other, aspects of, things that we're talking about tonight. So, yeah.
I think as a general principle, yes. I want to talk about, when we got our house, our partners, we looked specifically to be on the light rail line. We managed to be very lucky in doing so. And it's been a great move for us, and it really shows the potential of this kind of development. We have the capacity to get light rail in and out of the city quite easily. We live further out than we used to, but I actually feel like it's a more vibrant area because it's a denser area. We can walk to the shops, we can walk to, there's doctors that are opening across the road from us. There's a whole range of potential that happens when you kind of build in this kind of way, and doing it on transit-oriented corridors makes a lot of sense. And in the interim, before light rail comes in, we can have rapid buses going down these corridors to make it happen. And one of the things that we're also seeing around in places like London, for example, is the construction of cycling superhighways that run along similar kind of corridors that can actually go quite a long distance. And when they're built well, and when they allow people to go at speed, and particularly with the uptake of e-bikes, we're seeing in places like London that people will ride longer distances if there's good good infrastructure along the way. So I'd be thinking about, what's the transit corridor look like, not just for public transport, but for active transport as well. And can we have such, similar kind of infrastructure to make that happen? And if you've got that long and dense corridor, you could see quite a lot of success.
Right. Okay, we will go to Ryan. Okay.
G'day. First of all, I just want to thank the panel. My name's Ryan. I'm the chair of the Public Transport Association of Canberra, one of the signatories to the Missing Middle Coalition, and to an extent, Damien stole my question. But I'd like to just push a little bit further into one of the big themes which has emerged tonight, which is the inherent conservatism of EPSDD and the ACT government more broadly when it comes to more ambitious, progressive change. Because it's all well and good for us to sit here in this room and all agree that the Missing Middle campaign is excellent and we'd like to see these changes enacted. We may well get some recommendations out of the Territory Plan inquiry when it puts out its report on the interim Territory Plan early next year. But there's a very good chance that none of those recommendations will be actioned. So I guess, look, I've had some experience with this myself, dealing with EPSDD in multiple hats. I'm just curious as to, all of your experiences, what drives this conservatism that really rests at the heart of EPSDD and the ACT government's urban planning agenda more broadly? And what can we do to change their minds and move the conversation in a more positive, productive direction? Oh, what a question, Ryan. If I knew the answer to that, we'd be solving a lot of problems. It has been shocking to me coming in to working more closely. I don't work with EPSDD so much, but I work with TCCS to see the conservatism that exists in.
Just define it.
Oh, TCCS is Transport Canberra City Services, so they do all our transport infrastructure. And EPSDD is Environment Planning and Sustainable Development and something else. Like a directorate, that's the D. And yeah, it's frustrating, and I find that these directorates are often the place where good ideas go to die. And it's not. I think that's true. I think it's also our current government. In terms of the ministers, in terms of the people who have been elected, we have a really stable government, and I think in some ways they don't feel any threat, and that's a real problem because when you've been in power for 22 years, you can become really complacent, and it can be really it becomes really easy to be slow and lazy, to be quite frank. And I'm really noticing that in dealing with the government. It's really quite depressing. The way to deal with it, I think one of the things that has given me a lot of hope recently is seeing groups like Greater Canberra, like PTCBR. I think this is work that I'm trying to do with Pelcar as well, as becoming more vocal about it and actually becoming that pressure that the government needs to change. Because if the Liberal Party aren't going to ever be in power, which I don't think they ever will in this city, then we need somebody to be putting pressure on the government to make them change. And I think we are seeing that, but we're only at the starting part of that process. You know, a couple of years ago when I was involved in this kind of, you know, we had community councils complaining about development, but we didn't actually have the other side of it, of people who were doing this campaigning work. And so we need to be on the ground campaigning in the media. We need to be doing all of this kind of work to make it happen. And I think we will see change. It's frustrating and slow now, but sometimes when the public pressure, things tip very quickly. And I think we just need to keep having that public pressure out there.
This is. You'll hear other people hearing, unlike other people's responses on that, but my team will literally hate me if I do not point out that there is a email your MLA sign on the back of every row of shares. And you can do that just by getting your phone out.
I think you nailed it.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, the classic thing of invite your friends along to events like this, you know, let's put more and more pressure on, and if you get asked to do a radio interview, do it. Don't just leave it to all of us. There's the key players in the room, but yeah, do get active amongst your communities and spread the word. But I was, like Simon, incredibly excited by Greater Canberra's presence, because that's exactly what we need, is community-led interest and action. So get involved.
And infiltrate government. I mean, the reality is, I've been very critical of the planning minister, who has been the planning minister for 10 years next year. He's not a planner. He has literally no background in this. And there are other people in government that do. There is actually another MLA sitting in the Labor Party that has a planning background. I mean, there's a starting point, right? How about we elect the people that we want to create change into government?
All right, I know that we have gone past 8 o'clock, so we might take one last question. The only thing I would just add to all of that is all of it is incredibly good points. One thing that a lot of people do not realise about the ACT, and particularly at the ACT in regards to planning, is that the planning minister actually has a kind of limited role. As in, planning decisions in the ACT are made by the chief planner. The chief planner is also the director general of EPSDD. The chief planner can't be fired by the government because they disagree with his decisions. So that means that in the ACT, we do have a situation where the elected government isn't actually entirely in control of what happens in the planning system. Instead, it's this weird power sharing arrangement between the bureaucracy and the government, and the bureaucracy is not entirely beholden to the elected government in terms of how they operate. It's sort of a weird situation. It exists because of the ACT's history and how self-government came about, and also the history of the National Capital Development Commission before self-government came about. But it means that our planning politics ends up working quite substantially differently than the dynamic in the rest of the country, where we also do not have local governments. So it might get one final question. Oh, I just didn't want to waste everyone's time or attention, so they're on again. Okay, yeah.
Sorry.
So go to Rob.
I think it's been a really interesting conversation from the panel today, but it's been pretty wonky and focused on a lot of really important stuff. I'd really like to hear a bit more from Joel. I just heard the word functional housing spoken by someone earlier. And I'd like to know, what is it like what's the lived experience of the sort of marginal renters who are really struggling in the territory, and what sort of housing are they living in at the moment?
Yeah, thank you. I think I'll answer your question. I do sort of object a little bit to this idea of unconscionable housing, because I think we don't want to have people living in windowless rooms, but I think it's really hard to argue that that person is worse off by giving them that option. And that, you know, if we build that place with a windowless room, that person has more options than they had before that place was built. And I think if we actually have more housing in a more competitive housing sector, then that person is more empowered to choose the housing that's right for them. And I think in the real world in which we operate, the choice isn't for that person the windowless room or the window full room. It's often the windowless room or the car. And I almost think like that person we want to give them the best range of options. But I think sort of denying them those options is not necessarily the way to go. On the other hand, I don't think we want to accept this degradation of what we expect from our housing system either. And so this is the debates we have internally when you see people advertising garages. It does degrade what we ought to expect from housing, and that is a bad outcome. But I think the way we actually raise expectations of housing is basically putting pressure on developers to deliver a better product. And I think that happens when we do have that competition and an abundance out there. At the moment, we don't have that abundance. So I guess to your original question, it's a pretty straightforward relationship that when you see rents going up, really big rent increases, you see rates of homelessness going up as well. And I think that's one part of it, is people sleeping rough. Also, I guess, like secondary homelessness, so couch surfing, sleeping in cars, being overcrowded. But I think then there's sort of more widespread but less egregious. It's just all the people who aren't in a home that's right for them. They're having to put up with mouldy homes, with mould on their, growing their children's bedrooms, lots of issues around the cold, and just like being mistreated by their landlords, having what rights exist on paper, having very little legal effect. And there's sort of a whole pyramid of range of experiences there for those people. But yeah, I think it's rough, and I think that sort of vision for housing abundance is not only about having more housing, but certainly about giving those people more options and putting more pressure on the housing market to deliver a much better experience of home.
It is really rough. A lot of the housing in Canberra is really, really bad. And I actually have one of my architects in the audience tonight. Mitchie lives in a rental in Red Hills. This is an architect with interest in sustainability and energy efficiency. The rental she lives in got down to 4.5 degrees last winter, and that's on the second story living area. We test and retrofit houses across Canberra, and some of the conditions people are living in are just diabolical. It is appalling. So, social and affordable housing. I've got a stepson who lives with his mother in social housing, and that house is appalling. It's terrible. There is massive room for improvement, and it's urgent.
Have you tried not turning it off?
The problem is we get a very slight feedback when we don't turn it off, and we were worried about audio quality and also everyone's eardrums. So that's the reason why I have, but I apologise for the delay. Could you all please join me in thanking our panel? Thank you everyone for coming. Once again, we're a rather small jurisdiction in the ACT. We're actually the second largest local government area after the city of Brisbane. And we are in a position where we can actually influence our politics directly, because many of the MLAs actually get surprisingly little contact from people, and you can help change that by sending them an email. So once again, on the back of your chairs, let them know you support this. If you're because it does seem that there's a lot of stakeholder organisations in the audience tonight, which I did not entirely realise when asking people for questions. So apologies if I didn't recognise anyone, I should have. But if your organisation would also like to join the Missing Middle Coalition, please come and talk to us. We have the option to create a better city, and we can take it by advocating for changes like this. So thank you for coming out, everyone. We have the room until 9 o'clock. Feel free to mingle, talk with each other, get another drink, and yeah, thank you.
That's fine.